Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the third week of the course. Um, Kind of shifting our emphasis here, or at least the center of our attention, from the first canon, the whole paramount canon, to the fourth canon, the sort of duty to be a faithful agent of your client or employer. But it's we're talking about first canon ethics cases, the duty to hold paramount the health, safety, and welfare of the public. We oftentimes, in the same breath, find ourselves mentioning the fourth canon because it does seem that those two are in a lot of tension with each other. I won't say outright conflict, but that there's a tension between them, at least in the eyes of the Board of Ethical Review. And that's because oftentimes, to actually fulfill your first canon duties, you would not oftentimes, but sometimes, typically in these cases, that engineers who are trying to fulfill the obligations under the first canon find themselves in conflict with the wishes of their employer. I don't want to say the interests of their employer, because I think that that's something quite different. That is, to be in conflict with something that your employer or client wants is not the same thing as being in conflict necessarily with something that is in your client or employer's interest. It may be that the best interest of your employer is served by you blowing the whistle, for instance, or that question of interest doesn't really come into play because if your employer or client is doing something which is a hazard to public safety, the question of going against their interests is a little silly. It'd be like saying by turning a murderer into the police that we were going against his interests and we had to somehow. It's just not true. That is, it's clear, absolutely clear that the NSPE Code of Ethics makes a claim that there's a duty to clients and employers of some degree of loyalty, um, at least insofar as you have to be a faithful agent or trustee. And it may be good to think about that. What does it mean to be an agent? What does it mean to be a trustee? What kind of obligations are you taking on when you take on that role? One of the things we'll explore later in the class is some of the ambiguity in the fourth canon, because it would seem that the fourth canon considers the duties to clients on the one hand and duties to employer on the other to be the same sort of duties, and I don't think that that's true at all. I mean, that is, there may be duties to both, but they can't be of the same nature because it's a different sort of relationship. It would be very surprising were they of the same nature. But in any case, here's a case, 97-12, that is prominently a fourth canon case. This is the fourth canon right here. Engineers shall act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees. Here's another sort of fourth canon duty here. Under that general duty, not reveal facts, data, information, etc., that would apply in a very strange way if it applies to this case at all. And other relevant parts of the code, as we'll see, what your duties are when you have knowledge of a violation of the code, which certainly is the case here. And here's the violation here. Here's that is that his company, his or her company, I'm sorry, the engineer's company is definitely engaged in this violation of this part of the code. So we have what on the face of it is a fairly minor thing. I mean, kind of one of the misdemeanors of modern life: stealing software, stealing intellectual property, basically using computer programs, other such things, without paying for them. I think it's part of the facts, the simple facts of this case, that's what the engineering firm that this engineer works for is doing. SPQ, obviously made up, right? It's ancient Roman thing. SPQ engineering ignores this restriction and uses the software at a number of employee workstations. It's just part of the facts that a company is basically engaging in theft or breach of contract or intellectual property theft or whatever you call it. That is that, again, one of the misdemeanors of modern life that many of us have engaged in to one extent or another is stealing, using software without paying for it, something that's not in the public domain. In this case, much more, I would say, fateful thing when a company does it rather than an individual. And that's what's happening here. And I think that in a completely valid way, the engineer in question is, for some reason or another, troubled by it and calls a hotline that's been provided for just this reason. And reports his employer's activities, reports the fact that his employer is basically engaging in a form of theft. And the question, which I think is the proper question, because we're talking about engineering ethics here, which is the behavior of engineers, is not whether the firm was ethical in what it did. Clearly it wasn't, right? But the question is about the behavior of the engineer who's the focus here. Was it ethical for engineer A to report his employer's apparent violation? I would say it's beyond apparent, it's clear, of the licensing agreement on the hotline without first discussing his concerns with his employers. And their conclusion, of course, is when we read the decision, is no, it was not ethical. It was a violation. It was unethical. After the discussion, it was not ethical for the engineer to report his employer's apparent violation, although that's not really, again, a point in the case that's brought up. It seems to be a clear violation of the licensing agreement without first discussing his concerns with his employer. As is so often the case in professional ethics, engineering ethics especially, I guess, I don't know, is the question of discretion is very, very relevant, very salient. That is, it's not so much what you do ultimately, it's how you do it. That's discretion. That is, his concerns, or his or her concerns about the theft of the software, are completely valid. You're professional and you're being asked to use basically stolen tools to practice your profession. The CAD software at the workstations where it's not actually been paid for is being stolen, and you're being asked to work with stolen tools. It'd be like a workman given a shovel that you knew was stolen from somebody. You would have maybe qualms about using it, right? And especially as a professional, you're not supposed to be engaged in any kind of association with illicit activities, and this is what this is. How important it is, or how grave the sin is here, I don't know. It's a matter of discussion. So the concern is not misplaced, nor is pursuing the concern misplaced. It's how the concern is pursued that the Board of Ethical Review thinks is the problem. And again, the question of pursuing one's concerns within the company to the fullest extent before going outside the company, which is so often the BER's insistence, is the issue here. If we read the discussion, what really rankles the BER is that the engineer didn't discuss the matter with his employer before calling the hotline. We are troubled, they say, that engineer A did not consider other less adversarial and surreptitious alternatives. For example, engineer A could have first discussed this matter with his employer, etc., etc. Instead, engineer A took a course of action that could cause significant damage to SPQ engineering. It's not, that's an interesting point. You think about it, whether you agree with that. That is, whether he or she, is it a he? I'm sorry. I don't know. I don't want to be sexist about it. There's enough sexism in engineering that I don't want to add to it. So you decide whether that's really true. That is, whether this engineer, in calling this hotline, did engage in something irresponsible that could damage his or her employer. I don't know. Perhaps we can. There's a couple more points about this case, which I think are really important. So we'll do another video.